Hey friends, this is Anita with the Messy Middle, and I'm so excited to have Debbie Reber with us today. And you're going to be like parents, let me just warn you up front, you're going to be totally set free and be so encouraged in your parenting and where you're at with your own kids as we have this conversation. So Debbie, thank you so much for being here today and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Anita. I'm looking forward to this.
Absolutely. Okay, so Debbie, can you give us a little bit of like your background, like what's your superpower? And then we'll talk about what brought you to the spot of recognizing the superpower that you're currently operating in, and we'll go from there.
Wow, my superpower. That is such a good question. I think my superpower, I have a couple, but the one that is relevant to this conversation is I've always been someone who has been passionate about and actually unable to not create what I wish I had when I needed it. So my whole life has been about trying to help others avoid things, painful things, or have more tools than I had when I was going through painful periods of my life. And the other part of that is that I'm really good at being a deep diver of research and packaging it through writing or content or my podcast or whatever in ways that can be really accessible and relatable for other people. I don't know if that answers your question.
Okay. So that's a good, like we've just, for anybody who's listening right now, as we get into this conversation, like you've just barely touched like the tip of the iceberg of what we're going to talk about today. So yeah. How about you give us like your backstory? As we were doing our pre-conversation, you were chatting about how you'd been in kids TV and doing some documentary work, if I got that correct, and then in the corporate space, but then always maybe, at least what I heard you say, is there was like a restlessness inside of you that it was like, this really wasn't like the right thing. And then where you stepped into this day. So can you give us a little bit of that background and that story about really the journey that you've been on?
So I, in the early 90s, moved to New York City out of college, wanting to be Holly Hunter from Broadcast News. Like I wanted to be a big news producer. Yeah. And that led me into working in documentary production I worked for UNICEF for a number of years and for some other NGOs, always pro-social, trying to have an impact through the work I was creating. I loved that work, but then I decided that I needed to actually make some money because I was living in New York City. So I pivoted to corporate and I took some of the work I had done. I had formed relationships in kids TV. So I ended up working on Blue's Clues for a couple of years. I wrote about more than a dozen Blue's Clues books, but I managed special projects for them. I then moved to Cartoon Network where I developed original shows in Los Angeles for them for a couple of years. And I really liked all of that work. It was creative. It was fun, a great environment, inspiring colleagues, but I always had half a dozen things I was doing on the side, whether it was getting my master's at night, which I did when I was working for UNICEF, or writing a book, or figuring out how to write a book, or starting a nonprofit, co-founding a nonprofit in Los Angeles that mentored teen girl writers, I was just doing things all the time. Yeah. And I remember thinking that when am I just going to finally be satisfied with just going to work? I'd love to just go to work and then come home and chill out. And I was like, so I kept looking for the job that was going to allow me to do that.
Yeah.
And then I guess I now know that job doesn't exist except for the one that I've created for myself. So yes. I left the corporate world in 2003, really because of an unhealthy work environment. Just wasn't a good place for me. And so I was like, I think I can do this. I can I'll cobble together freelance writing and consulting, and I can make this work. And yeah, so that was 21 years ago. And of course, my work has pivoted again into this parenting space, which I'm sure we'll talk more about.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Don't we know sometimes as either in the corporate space as closet entrepreneurs? I actually think entrepreneurship is really more of a mindset more than anything else. I can have an employee mindset or I can have an entrepreneur mindset, and it doesn't really matter how I get paid. But I notice as I talk to clients, and part of my story and what I hear out of your story is that, and I love this, it's like I went over here and it didn't quite fit. And then I went over here and it didn't quite fit. There was like this restlessness That's how it was for me. Those are the words that I used to describe it
Mm-hmm.
as, really? And I remember having those same thoughts as well of, wouldn't it be nice if I could just have a job that when I'm done, I could turn my phone off? And no, I worked for big global organizations. And so if you turned your phone off at 9 o'clock, it didn't matter because Europe was waking up as soon as you were going to sleep. Or from Southern California, the time difference is such that it just doesn't ever work out that way. It never really stops. Yeah. Okay. So then what was your next step? Like you said that you left and you started piecing things together. So what brought you into where you are right now with Tilt Parenting?
Yeah. So I originally, by the time I left, I had written and published my first book. It was called Run for Your Life, a book for beginning women runners. I was an avid runner, and I believe that it's such a wonderful thing for emotional and physical well-being for women. Still a runner and still believe that. So I wrote that book, and then, but my passion at the time was really teen girls specifically, and really wanting teen girls to have more confidence, to have more ideas about the potential that they had. And so I started focusing specifically on teens, and I did that from 2005 probably until 2012, 2013. And I published several nonfiction books for teens. I did a series for Chicken Soup for the Teenage Soul. For girls, I created a series of teen authored memoirs with that same publisher. And I would speak to groups of girl conferences. I consulted for the Girl Scouts. So I was really in that zone and loving that work, because I considered myself a recovering teen. And then I became a parent of not a teen girl. I became a parent of a neurodivergent child, and started feeling really pulled in a different direction because of the demands of just advocating for it and understanding who this kid was. And one of my best friends who I had met at Blue's Clues, I remember talking with her and just saying, gosh, I've spent so long building up this brand as this teen girl authority and doing this work, and I love this work, but I don't have time because I'm doing all this other stuff, and I'm having to become an expert in all these other things. And she said to me very wisely, Debbie, I think that your parenting journey is so much more a part of your mission and your purpose and what you're going to do in your work as well than you realize. And I was very dubious at the time, but she was absolutely right. So it was in 2011, 2012 that I started to fully commit to, okay, I'm going to do the hard pivot, and I'm going to shift my focus to supporting parents.
Yeah. Isn't it so fun too so I have 2 teens still in my house and an older child out of the house. And one of the things that I've told them over the years is you don't have to figure out, because we get this noise, this information that says at 18 years old, you got to figure out where you're going to go to college. What are you going to do for the rest of your life? Whether it's phrased that way or not, that's sometimes the underlying message in society in America today. And yet what we've done in our household, and I looked at my kids, is there's so many ways that you can go after what you're good at, what your purpose is. It's going to change. It's going to ebb. It's going to flow. What I hear from you, Debbie, and what I love about your story is that it gives you the option. What I hear is that you had the option to say, I was in this season at this point in time, but then I shifted to this season. And there's so much freedom in that. Like the idea that we don't have to, like for me, I'm so excited to hear more about your story, because the idea that you don't have to decide at any point in time that this is what we're going to be stuck with forever. Like I know I've coached a lot of brand new entrepreneurs that have transitioned from the corporate space into entrepreneurship. And there's a lot of, hey, Anita, this is what I was good at, and now do I have to go do that? Or what if I want to do something completely different? The answer to all that is yes. You can do all of it. And there's going to be seasons where you do some different things and you ebb and you flow and you pivot, whether it's in content creation or book creation or in your business. That's actually what gets me so excited about business and being an entrepreneur, is that you get to choose your area of focus. Now, notice what I didn't say. I didn't say go after 5 different things that you feel like you're good at. I recently heard a woman say, like a prospective client, she said, I'm just good at everything. And I'm like, ooh, that's like dangerous language in the entrepreneur space. But I love part of your journey and your story. So tell us more. Like, when you pivoted and went into the next season, so you have this beautiful child that your heart is saying, I want to serve him in a different way and serve my family in a different way. What does that look like?
Yeah, there were a lot of changes that happened at once. So we had been living in Seattle at the time, and it had been suggested by an educator friend more than once that my child would do better being homeschooled. And I was not into that. I was like, no, that is not happening. But what was happening wasn't working. We moved around to a couple different schools. And then my husband got an opportunity to have his job moved to the Netherlands. And so we were like, you know what? Like we've burned through 4 schools here. Yeah. We haven't found the right fit. Maybe we need to just shake things up. We didn't have family in the Pacific Northwest. There was really nothing holding us there. So we decided to make that move right when my child was starting the summer between 2nd and 3rd grade. And we decided this is the right time to start homeschooling. So we just threw out all the rules, and it was a huge leap and scary, but we knew it was the right thing. And so it was after maybe a year or so of homeschooling, and I really started to understand who my child was on a completely different level, and was doing so much work on myself as well to just come to accept and really embrace all the things that were messy about our lives. And I was like, you know what? I think I'm ready to start to do this pivot. And actually, because I'm a writer and I'd published many books, I still had my agent. And so we're like, let's write the book. So I actually wrote a book proposal thinking I'll start with this, but I always knew I was going to create something else. I wanted to create like an online destination where parents like me could go and feel like really good about the aesthetic experience, the way the website looked, the vibe. They didn't feel like that this is a problem and need a fixing. I wanted them to feel like really good about, this is the cool club. Welcome to the cool club. So I always knew that was going to happen. But I wrote a book proposal first, which we did not sell because at the time the feedback was like, we don't need another special needs memoir. There's already one in the world. That's enough. I was like, okay, that's not really what I'm trying to do here, but that's okay. So I put that on the back burner, and I spent a year researching what I wanted to create and really talking to other parents, making sure that the things I was struggling with were the same things they were struggling with. And I had my bigger vision was that this is a revolution. Like, we need to completely shift the paradigm for parents raising neurodivergent kids. We need to change the experience for our kids in schools and in societies. We need to change the experience for parents. So I researched the Tilt Parenting Revolution, and I launched it in 2016 with a podcast, a couple of episodes, 3 followers of my husband and my mom and my sister on social media. And I just started to get the word out there, and it took off from there.
Okay. So that's beautiful. But just to take one half step back, can you give us the definition of, I got to get the word right, the word that you're using, I'm looking at your website, neurologically atypical, but you're using a different word. So if somebody's not sure, what is that word she keeps saying? What does that mean? What's the definition of that? What's the framework that we're coming from in the verbiage that you're using right now?
Yeah, thanks for that. I spend so much time in this space. I forget what people don't know. So the word I'm using now is neurodivergent, which is a spinoff from neurodiversity, right? Neurodivergent really just is the understanding and awareness that there are very normal variations in the way brains are wired and the way people experience the world. When I started Tilt Parenting, that language was not being used. Everything was disorder based. So autism spectrum disorder, ADHD is a disorder, very deficit based, very medicalized, pathologizing language. And so I use the term differently wired because I was like, this isn't a problem. This is a normal, there's more than 20% of people who have things like ADHD, who are autistic, who have learning disabilities like dyslexia, who are gifted, which is also a form of neurodivergence. So there are a lot of people who fall under this umbrella. And that's part of what I wanted to get out there in starting Tilt, was just a deeper understanding of neurodivergence, and actually a recognition that there is no normal, that normal doesn't exist, right? There's no one way to be a human.
Yeah. What are some of the markers of a neurodivergent? What does that look like? I know, we've had a lot of friends over the years that have walked a very similar path. And as you're talking, I'm listening it back in my brain. I'm remembering the language that they've used and spoken over their kids. I know just for a lot of our audience that are Christians and believers, like we know that he's not a God of disorder. There's never a person that he's made on the planet, regardless of belief system, that was never not made on purpose and for a purpose. And God's a God of order, even if our brains work differently than somebody else's perception of how a brain should work. What are some of those markers? So that I'm also thinking sometimes in our journey, we've been homeschoolers for 15 years. And just as a mom and a parent and a homeschooler and all this kind of stuff, we've seen lots of different kids that are homeschooled and lots of different just approaches in life and challenges, shall I say. And I'm wondering, sometimes I'm thinking about a friend actually years ago, and there was a lot of, the child's behavior was a little bit different, but the family was like, nope, everything's okay. And I'm like, but I've actually asked you probably 3 questions right there.
It's all good. I'm taking notes.
I'm so excited to have this conversation with you, because I really believe you're helping a mom and a dad right now, or a child that's listening, to take whatever the next step is.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. So many good questions in there. And so what I'll say is that one of the first things that is important to know is that a lot of the differences are invisible. So with someone who is in a wheelchair or who is disabled in a way that is really obvious, that's a different experience, right?
Yes.
But when someone has a learning disability, that's often invisible. When someone is autistic and they have lower support needs, it might not be evident externally that there's something going on. ADHD might just look like a really rambunctious little kid, or a spacey kid, or whatever. Yeah. But what's important to note is that what we notice are the behaviors, right? The kids who tend to struggle in traditional settings would be a sign. If a child is getting dysregulated, maybe they're really sensitive to noises or to sounds, or they're very aware of other people's energy. And then that it just triggers this kind of response in their nervous system and their brain. And so they can have a meltdown, or those kids who are a little more sensitive in that way is often a sign. So a lot of what I talk about when I speak to school communities and to educators is the fact that if there's behavior that is perplexing or challenging or disruptive and all of those things, that is usually a sign that there's something going on beneath the surface. I believe that there's very little real bad behavior that's willful. It's usually a sign of a lagging skill or an inability to do something different in that moment because of where the person is on their developmental timeline. So there's a lot of misunderstanding, but usually the signs would be that external behavior, or a child who struggles to read or isn't where you might think they might be. They might have a learning disability like dyslexia, or someone who's really struggling to read social cues and who's missing some signals from their peers or isn't really following along. That could be a sign that that child is autistic or a child with ADHD. If we start paying attention, and if we as parents, I always say, if you have a feeling that something's not quite right, then I would follow that intuition and get curious about what might be going on.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. What about the other side of the spectrum? Like those kids that they are more gifted and actually they're acting out because they're not challenged anymore in the classroom. Like that, I noticed, like for my stepson, that was one of those things. I distinctly remember he was 9 years old. He came to our house. My husband said, hey, by the way, all honor to his mother, his birth mother for sure. But what the school was telling her is they wanted to diagnose him with all these different labels. Being the step parent, I looked at my husband. I was like, that's not your kid at all. Like, you guys know him better. You've known him longer. But this is my assessment, is that he's not any of those things. He's just actually really smart. And he's having a hard time in the environment of sitting in a classroom because he's not challenged at all.
Yeah.
And so how about those kids? Like they're on, so we talked about one side of the spectrum, one's not higher or lower, anything like that, but just the other side of the spectrum where you mentioned one of the categories is somebody who's a little bit more gifted. So how do we tackle that a little bit and help a parent that has a child that's in that case as well?
I think it's so important to even just use the word gifted because there's a lot of pushback in many communities. All children are gifted, but if you look at the bell curve for an IQ test, right? Most people are in the middle of that bell curve, and then you've got people who are at the lower end, and those would be people who have some cognitive delays, developmental disabilities that might mean they're going to need a lot more support. But at the other end of the bell curve, it's the same thing. So you might have kids who are way off the chart there. Their needs are just as important, and that is something that actually isn't recognized a lot. And one way that a lot of gifted kids, and I'll just say my kid used to sneak read a Kindle in class and would get in trouble, but because of boredom. Why would I do this worksheet? I learned this stuff years ago. Right. I read that I could be teaching this class, right? I read the textbook already, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So it is really challenging for gifted students, and acceleration alone, which is often the answer, it's often what a school will suggest, will bump you up a grade or will give you harder work. That can help, but a gifted person also tends to have some of these other sensitivities. They tend to be more empathetic. They tend to be more aware of the sensory things around them. Yeah. So there can be a lot of other things going on. And there's actually a category within neurodivergence called twice exceptional. And that is someone, that's what my child is. That's someone who's both cognitively, intellectually gifted and has one or more of these other neurodevelopmental differences. And those kids are really tricky because the asynchronicity of their development, they could be like explaining quantum physics to you, but really struggling or be lower than their same age peers in terms of some social emotional development. And imagine going through the world being able to understand these concepts at this very deep level that you're not really mature enough to fully process. That's a really hard way to go through life as well.
It is. It is. I was a youth leader for a time, and the difference in so when my daughter was in 6th grade and I was her youth leader for middle school, the difference between what the girls were talking about at 6th grade, so 11-ish years old, and the girls that were talking at 8th grade, just the conversations that you have. And we've seen this in our household and in friends' household where academically the child is very advanced, but maturity wise, they are not. And so it is a really interesting like cross section and I don't know. I'm thinking of a word that I don't want to say out loud. So it's an interesting, it's just an interesting cross section where some areas are like off the charts amazing, but then other areas are just a little bit less mature. And so that does create this interesting, I feel like all of our kids have this interesting dynamic. And I just believe so strongly, like we are called as their parents to be their number one advocate and to figure out, again, in my framework, how God has uniquely designed them, because each student, regardless of how you choose to school, that's not what we're talking about here, but regardless of how you educate, each child has strength. Each child has areas for improvement. Each of our kids has these areas that they can blossom in. So I love, Debbie, that you spent the time to figure this out for your kid and to be able to say, this is where he's amazing. And then these are the areas that we're growing in, because isn't that the truth for all of us? I know my husband and I have had these conversations over the years, and he used to basically mimic what his dad would say. My husband is the next generation above me. He's a little bit older than me, but he would say things that I know that this basically came from his parents, like, why would you do this, 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 and this? And I was like, but babe, what if you had what if you were given the opportunities to flourish in that way? And all of a sudden his perspective started to shift and was like, oh, you're right. Actually, I did struggle in these areas because I didn't get this kind of attention that would have maybe been more beneficial. So now as an adult, and he's able to thrive in the areas that are exactly this right sweet spot for him. Now he sees differently. Oh, Okay, now I know what she was always talking about. So I
The
love that.
strengths are
That's so
so
awesome.
important. That is what it's all about. We all, and this is again what we were talking about at the beginning, we all want to find a way to spend our lives doing work that we feel we can get in flow. We feel like we're in our strength zone. We feel like we're in our really competent and brings us joy. So unfortunately, a lot of our kids can get the message in some systems or schools that they're broken, right? We got to fix this. We need to get you to fit in. But when we can frame that narrative and look at what are the incredible strengths that this child has exactly as they are, and how can we lean into those? Because that's where hopefully they're going to grow up and spend most of their time in that strengths zone.
I love that. I love that. I also love, as you and I were talking about before we even started recording, was just listening to you in this season. It sounds like stepping just more into your purpose and more into your calling just for this season. So what about you? Like, how have you been able to navigate this season of just all the things that we've talked about so far? And what I see about you, Debbie, and what I love about your story is you seem to have such a peace about where you are right now and what you're doing and the community that you're creating. And so I just want to encourage you to keep going on that. But let's talk about that a little bit, because you do seem like you're just right exactly where you're supposed to be in stepping into your purpose just for this season.
Yeah, I feel that way. I didn't always feel that way, but this work that I've done, and it's been over 8 years since I launched Tilt, it is, and still parenting through very complicated years over that time, still in it for sure. But the journey has been so fulfilling, both professionally and personally. I've learned so much about myself. I have found myself in a community of incredible people who are doing this work. Like when I look at some of my friends, I'm like, how did I end up friends with a world-renowned neuroscientist? How did that happen? That's cool. I have a lot of those moments like, how did I end up here? This is amazing. And I get so inspired by the people who are also committed to the same mission and really helping kids be their best selves. That on a personal level has been so incredibly fulfilling. Also, learning about my own neurodivergence has really been healing for me to really reconcile a lot of stuff from my childhood. I'm like, oh, it's all coming together now. But it's also allowed me to do my work moving forward without that kind of niggling voice, like you don't really belong here, or I'm just like, this is who I am, and this is the support that I need to really show up in this space. So I do feel like I'm in my strength zone now. And as someone who I've realized, I took this thing called the Sparketype. I don't know if Jonathan Field's work.
I don't know that one.
He is something called the Good Life Project is his podcast, but he created this tool. It's an assessment tool where you can identify your Sparketype. And it's basically what it is that actually makes you feel purpose in your work. And so not like the right career, but what is it that makes you feel most fulfilled? And I took his assessment. I thought it's got to be like serving other people or the kind of work I've always done, like creating community, which is what I do. But actually my core Sparketype is a maker. And I was like, oh, that's what it is. So I am a maker. I made my own website. I make my podcast. Like I do everything because I love making stuff. The context in which I'm making it is also something I feel very passionate about. But the fact that I get to be a maker every day, and I'm like, I want to do a live event with this expert next week. Okay, I'll make it happen. I can do whatever I want. It's my business. So I love that freedom and flexibility.
Oh, I love that for you. And I see the spark kind of like fire up even more as you're talking about it. That's so fun.
Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome. That's awesome. Okay, so let's talk about tilt parenting a little bit more. We touched the tip of that a little bit, but what's the community like? What's the purpose of what you do? What are maybe some of the core principles that you walk parents through that are in this season that really need this right now?
Yeah. So I mentioned I started it with a podcast. So I'm still doing that. I just released episode 381 earlier this week.
Nice.
So I
Good job.
love that work. It keeps me busy because of all the reading that I have to do, but that's okay. So I have the podcast and then I do a lot of live events, but about 4.5 years ago now, almost 5 years ago, I created a community, a formal kind of membership community, which at the time they're everywhere now, but at the time there weren't too many in my space. But what I really wanted to do was create a place for parents who are really in this really tricky season of life and who are parenting really complex kids and are rejecting the idea that there's something wrong with them and really want to lean into this neurodivergent affirming framework for us to come together so we can support ourselves and learn and grow together. So that work, I started it. I don't even remember how many people were in it. It's not huge, which is great. I love that community. I do several live office hour calls a month, a coaching call, and I get off those calls and I just feel so just grateful that I get to be in relationship and community with these parents and the fact and honored that I get to be a part of their journey and helping them make meaningful change and find more peace in their parenting journey. So it's just the most incredible work. That's by far the favorite part of what I do. And just getting to hang out with brave, thoughtful parents who are showing up for their kids and they love their kids so dearly and are committed to doing their own work on themselves. It's really inspiring to me.
Yeah, I've heard you say a couple of times, and I guess I put it in this language. This is my context for it, is that when you raise your kids, and I'll just say, especially if you homeschool, the opportunity for you as the parent to be sanctified and to grow and mature exists every single day. Because when you're in the midst of that and the schooling, there's academic stuff, a whole bunch of academic stuff, but even more character building that's happening. And it's not only happening for you, but it's also happening for your kids. The other thing that I heard you say that I really love for you is because in a lot of times when you're in an online business, there's a model that says the only way to be successful, which is so silly, let's just say that up front, is that you have to have these gigantic volumes of audiences and peoples and memberships and all that kind of stuff. That's what I always hear a lot of times, that we're only successful with volume. I actually don't ascribe to that at all. I love this for you. I love the more intimate, smaller communities, conversations where you really get to know people. But actually what I love about it is that there's room for all of us in this business to be able to create businesses the way that we enjoy interacting with people. Some people that like the volumes, like, that's amazing, go do that. If that's how you're wired, yes, it's totally a yes for you. But for those of us that like a little bit more of a intimate, deeper conversations, and just, I know, like for even the podcast, the messy middle, like I love the life that happens way down in the muck and the mire, because to me, that's where real life actually happens. And that, I just love that. Like I will love getting in nose hair deep with all the stuff that's going on in life, because I think it's so beautiful when you're able to come out of it and really celebrate one another and how far we've come. And so those are, while you didn't say it that way at all, I'm also picturing for you. I love hearing you describe your community, regardless of size, is so fulfilling for you and for them, because we're just all on this journey. So I guess the big takeaway for anybody who's listening to this little segment part is just find your community. Find what works for you and your community, and find some support along the way. Don't do life alone. Find the people that are your people, and then just go all in with those people, because the size really doesn't matter. It's about being able to connect in a way that we can grow, we can mature, we can love one another better, we can show up better, we can live more purpose, more on fire for the things that we're called to do. Yeah.
You said it beautifully.
What's that?
You said that beautifully. Yes.
Yeah. Any last remaining thoughts as we're getting ready to wrap things up here? What are some ways that people can connect with you? What would be like, oh, I know. First, what would be like the one big takeaway that if someone is struggling right now with what we're talking about, raising a child that has, I want to use my words properly, that looks different than what society tells us is the norm, and wants to be able to press in more in that. And especially that mom that knows that it's time for her to take a next step and do something a little bit different, because she has such a great love for her child and for her children and for her family. She's crying out right now, I need some help.
Gosh, there's so many things I would say, but to that parent, but I always like to say, first of all, just a reminder that our kids are not broken. They are exactly who they're meant to be. So
That's right.
If you notice that you're in fix it mode, or you're really trying to get back on track of the vision you had, or your expectations for who your child would be or what your family life would look like, be really kind and gentle with yourself as you start to do your own pivot and realize, actually, this is going to look different, and that's okay. And what it actually could look like, I think, can be so much richer and deeper. I think the way that we can connect with our kids and the relationships we can have can be so much deeper, because they demand so much more of us. Just like homeschooling, it's the same thing. Like, we have these incredible relationships with our kids. And then the other thing I would just say is, there's really no room for guilt or just beating ourselves up for not figuring things out sooner, or for the choice. Right. It's just, we are humans living a very human experience. And so I just really encourage people to practice a lot of self-compassion and gentleness and kindness with themselves, and just show up for themselves and their kids every single day.
Yeah, that's a good word right there. And when you think about it, no matter what your girlfriends are doing or your whatever, none of that matters. You're called to show up in the way and that you're called to show up, and everybody's on their own journey. Even though it feels like we look similar and we want to compare and all that kind of stuff, the sooner, I dare say, especially as women, the sooner we can disconnect from those comparisons, the more satisfied we're actually going to be with our own husbands, our own children's, our own lives, our own businesses, because we're all designed to just live in the path that we have laid out in front of us. And so I just echo what Debbie said, like, you're on a journey. Just be on the journey that you're on. Doesn't have to have a specific outcome, or I don't know, from those of us that come from the corporate space, we're all about goals and reaching those goals, and we're not happy until we reach those goals. No, that's not what life is all about. It's about this beautiful journey that's laid out before us. And some of it's hard, and some of it is absolutely incredible and amazing. A lot of it actually is amazing. And just step in more to that today. It's almost, like to say, it's like putting on a coat that doesn't fit anymore. That's not your right size. Just take the coat off. Just divorce yourself from some of those old thoughts. Maybe somebody spoke something over you or your child that's not even yours. It's not the truth. Just divorce yourself from that entirely and start walking in. Just take that next step. That's all. Yeah. That's all you have to do today. Yeah.
It's great.
Oh, Debbie, I love you, my new friend. I'm so excited to just meet you and just talk to you. I am having so much fun in this conversation. I wish we could go on for another couple hours. But as we wrap up here, what's a way that people can connect with you directly? I know you've mentioned you have podcasts and you're a prolific author and you have a community. Like, what's the best way that you'd like for people to connect with you?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you also for this conversation. It was really fun to reflect and to talk about all this stuff. So tiltparenting.com is the home for really everything. You can read a free chapter of my book. You can listen to the podcast. I have a couple. And in fact, if there are parents who are new to this journey, I have 2 free video series. One is called 10 Things I Wish I Knew about raising a neurodivergent kid. You can sign up for those, and that'll give you a really nice introduction to the mission and that I'm on here at Tilt Parenting. I'm also on social media somewhat inconsistently on Facebook and Instagram at Tilt Parenting.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Hey, I just want to honor you, Debbie, and what you're doing and what you're called to do right now. I honor the amazing parent that you are. I honor where your heart's been in this season to be able to step more into what I would call like your God-given purpose and passion. And I thank you for every single family that you're going to touch with this message today, and the way that you're just going to set them free so that they can take the next step on their journey as well.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody. You'll be able to see all the details that Debbie has mentioned in the show notes, and we'll talk to you soon.